see a picture of the cover of one of those on the screen behind me. He's also the author of numerous articles in both academic journals and in the popular media. He blogs daily at The Way of Improvement Leads Home, a blog devoted to American history, religion, politics, and academic life. And he serves as the executive editor of Current, an online magazine of opinion and commentary. In addition, he hosts 2 podcasts and speaks regularly to churches, school and teacher groups, civic groups, and historical societies. Please join me in once again welcoming Professor Fiat.
Thanks. Good evening. This morning I was a chapel speaker. Tonight I get to be a historian, although I was a little bit of a historian this morning as well, if you were there, trying to draw historical examples for us to think about. I'm always a little sheepish when I give this lecture just because of the title. This is, as Professor Faber said, this is a very contested subject in our political culture today. I am trying to treat it as a historian might treat the subject. Trying to, and this is what I tried to do in the book. This is a first edition I have here with all my notes and everything in it. But I tried to, when I approached this project, I began to say, what was the founders' belief about the role of religion in the republic that they were trying to create, and specifically the role of Christianity? What if I were to do my best, I think this is actually impossible, but what if I were to try to think about this question without all of the political posturing that's associated with it in our day and age today? So I proposed a book titled Religion and the American Founding, or something like that. And I sent it to my editor, and she emailed me back and said, "You're going to sell more books, and we'll be happier if you change the title to Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? That title you're suggesting is too boring." So I went with that title. As what might come out in the course of the lecture, I have some issues even with the title of my own book because it's essentially an ahistorical question, which means that very few people were asking this question in the 18th century. Right? It's really a product of sort of modern political debates. It really is not a question that most Americans, as we'll see in a second here, were even asking until like the late 1970s, believe it or not. Right? But nevertheless, what I want to do today is give you a kind of brief overview of how religion intersected with the Founding Fathers. Today I told a class, a couple classes actually, go on Google, try this tonight, right? When you go back to your Juntos and mental improvement societies. Try this. Google the word Founding Fathers and then lock it in for the last 24 hours. Right? You know how you can do that on Google, the time, just the things that have been published in the last 24 hours. You will see everything. The Founding Fathers were in favor of this. The Founding Fathers would never have believed this. The Founding Fathers this. And every political, cultural, social position under the sun. Right? The Founding Fathers wouldn't have, right? And that's what's going on, I think, here in this Christian America question. Right? If you can somehow get the Founding Fathers on your side on this question, you can advance whatever your present day political or cultural or whatever it is agenda in the present. And we've seen a lot of this, both on the left and the right. And most of the defenders of the idea that America is founded as a Christian nation and those who ardently oppose the idea that Christianity had nothing to do with the founding are both wrong. At least that's my working thesis, right? Having said that, I can't think of a time, it hasn't happened yet here at Tabor, maybe it won't, but I shouldn't say I can't think of a time, but there have been many times where I have come into a lecture hall and have somebody come up to me. This book was published in 2012, so I've been talking about this for a while. And have someone come up to me and say, the answer to the question up on the screen that I'm seeing right now is yes. Or the answer is no. Right? And I go, you haven't heard me say anything. You haven't heard me talk yet. I mean, why are you, this is a topic in which people's minds seem to be made up before they even hear any evidence. Right? So, was America founded as a Christian nation? To me, you can decide after I present some of this information, right? But it's certainly a question that is on the minds of a lot of political pundits these days as they try to think about how Christians should engage in public life and political life. Having said that, this is not a political talk tonight. This is a history lecture, right? So you'll see what I mean here in a second. So, let's begin with some thinking about this idea of America as a Christian nation. Let's get the first slide up. And you see there, every person in this picture, some of you, depending on your age, may not recognize some of them, but every person in this picture at one point or another advanced, not just mentioned that America was a Christian nation, but advanced the idea that they wanted to build a Christian nation in the United States. The difference is they all meant different things by that. So the idea that America is somehow a Christian nation, or is founded, as I should say, as a Christian nation, has deep roots in the history of the Republic. People didn't question this idea. Now again, I'm not saying they were right or they were wrong, or they interpreted the founding accurately or didn't interpret the founding correctly. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is they believed they were living in a Christian nation. They may have been woefully, deceived to believe that, or they could have been exactly right. So this is a historical claim I'm making. So let's take Martin Luther King Jr., right? Martin Luther King Jr. used what might be called Christian nationalist language over and over and over again. He constantly talked about the Judeo-Christian roots of the United States. And for him, a Christian nation was that we must live up to those Judeo-Christian values and celebrate the dignity of all human beings. Read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He wants to call Americans to a more just, more Christian society. And the way to do that is to end Jim Crow, end segregation, fight for the civil rights and voting rights of African Americans, and so forth. But he couched his arguments in a kind of Christian nation language. Some of you may not be familiar with the next guy up there, Washington Gladden. He was a social gospeler. In other words, he believed that the essence of Christianity was to solve the social ills of society, namely poverty and the plight of the poor, so to speak. He was a minister in the early 20th century, and he believed that if the Christian church would be mobilized to such an extent that they could solve the social problems of the day, homelessness, poverty, so forth, then that would make America a Christian nation. He also believed it would actually trigger the millennia, the return of Christ, right? But his idea was, we need to do all of these things that, today maybe you hear from the left about how to solve all of these problems. We need to do all of these things to make America into a Christian nation. The social gospel he was a representative of. I don't know if anyone recognizes the next guy, Jerry Falwell. He is the founder of a school in Lynchburg, Virginia, known as Liberty University. His son was the president of that school for a while. Jerry Falwell in the 1970s began to travel around the country with the Liberty Baptist College, as it was called then, choir, on a God and country tour to state capitals. He would visit every state capital. He would give a patriotic message. America has declined from its Christian roots, was his argument. America has gone astray. We've lost our way. The founders created a Christian nation, and we need to reclaim it and bring God back to America where it belongs and where the founders thought it belonged. And then he became a leader of this political movement known as the Christian or the religious right, which essentially has the agenda of trying to restore the United States to a Christian nation, or as they understand it, their Christian roots. America is a Christian nation, according to Falwell, and we need to get it back. Now, normally when you think about people arguing for Christian America, you don't normally think of a pope being on the list. But this is Pope Leo XIII, and he was the pope around the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. Pope Leo XIII is interesting because all these Protestants were running around saying we need to get back to our Christian roots. We need to get back to America as a Christian nation. They were called fundamentalists, these Protestants, right? We need to save Christian civilization. And Pope Leo XIII actually bought into that kind of strategy, except he argued, all you Protestants, you've only been here since, 1607 in Jamestown. We Catholics have been here, St. Augustine, Florida, and all the missions out on the West Coast. We've been here way before you, the Spanish Catholics. So if anyone has a claim to America being founded as a Christian nation, we do, right? So even Catholics are engaging in this Christian nationalist language in the late 19th and 20th century. Who's the next guy over? Anybody? I want someone under 20 to tell me who this is. Huh? Billy Graham. Good. I was joking with a class today that some of my students don't know who Billy Graham is. Billy Graham, popular revivalist in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Many lists you'll see. When I was younger, you'd see these lists of who is the most popular man in America. And Billy Graham would always be number one or number two, maybe behind the president or something. Billy Graham believed that he wanted to get everybody saved, born again, have a conversion experience. Come up, the altar call, come up front. The band or the music plays, Just As I Am. Everyone comes to the front of the stadium and confesses Christ, right? He believed that the best way to make America more Christian was to get more and more people saved. And then America would be Christian, and we would not be like those godless communists in the Soviet Union. And by the way, some of you are old enough to know that oftentimes you've heard either your elders or your friends, back in the day, godless communist was one word. The godless communists, right? And Billy Graham thought if more and more people had conversion experiences and were saved, America would become a more Christian country. Now, most of you have probably not heard of Mercy Otis Warren. Mercy Otis Warren was actually one of the first American historians. She was the brother of Joseph Warren, who was a patriot in Boston. And in 1802, she wrote one of the early histories of the United States. And the entire history is essentially what today we might call a providential history. She argues that, 26 years earlier in 1776, when the nation was founded, it was God who founded America. America was exceptional because it was the only nation founded by a providential act of God, she argued. And George Washington and all the founders were Christians. And we need to celebrate in 1802, 26 years later, we need to celebrate the Christian founding. And Mercy Otis Warren's books were very popular in schools in the early 19th century. And most school children were imbibed with this idea that America's founding was Christian, or America was founded as a Christian nation. So what is my point? The larger point here is this idea of Christian America. The first point I want to leave you with today. This idea of Christian America has been around for a long time, and Americans have always believed that in one form or another, they were either living in a Christian nation or they needed to restore America to a Christian nation. And in the book, I list, probably 10 or 12 other examples of this. I was just reading last night. My next guest on my podcast is a woman named Janine Giordano Drake, who wrote a phenomenal book about Christians and socialism. And even reading that, some of these like socialist Christians at the turn of the 20th century were deeply using like Christian nation language, right? We need to fight for the working people, the working man, bring equality and so forth, because that's what God wants, right? It's amazing how deeply some of these socialists were involved in Christian thinking. So that's my first point. Americans have always believed that they were living in a Christian nation. Let's get to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me add one more thing to this. I forgot about this slide. Sorry. The Civil War is a really interesting case study in this idea of how Americans thought about whether or not they were living in a Christian nation. The guy you see there, Rufus Choate, was a Massachusetts senator. He was a strong advocate of the idea that the American Union, the nation, right, founded by the Constitution in 1787, ratified in 89, by 89. Choate believed that the Union was somehow sacred. The nation was sacred. It was exceptional. The Constitution to him was one step below the Bible. It was a sacred document for Rufus Choate. A united, loving, and Christian America, right? That God uniquely blessed this country with a strong union. Of course, on the other side of the equation in the 1860s, you had the Confederate States of America. And you may think that early on the Civil War was about slavery and about people ending, the abolitionists believed that the North believed they were a Christian nation because they were fighting slavery, right? Now, some of that was there. But most of the Northerners believed that they were a Christian nation, especially Northern ministers, believed that they were a Christian nation because the Union was sacred and could not be divided up. And what the Confederacy was doing was dividing a God-ordained institution. That was Rufus Choate's position. That was Henry Ward Beecher's position, who was probably one of the most popular. He was like the Billy Graham of the 19th century. So they saw the Confederacy, of course they opposed slavery, but they also saw the Confederacy as divisive, dividing a unified nation that God had created. Well, the Confederacy responds, right, by saying, no, we are Christians because the Bible does not condemn the institution of slavery, they argued. They made, I would say, I disagree with them, but rather sophisticated arguments from the Bible, from theology, from kind of natural law about why slavery was okay once it was introduced. Their issue was because we uphold this divinely sanctioned institution of slavery, God must be on our side. We're the Christian side on this. I know that sounds disturbing today, but the past is a foreign country, they say, right? This was a popular view in the South in the 19th century. So when they wrote their Constitution, how many of you, just to stop for a second, how many of you memorized of a certain age, memorized the preamble to the Constitution? You know where I'm going with this? Through the, what were those commercials called? Schoolhouse Rock, right? And that's how I actually, as a kid in the 70s, I was the original Schoolhouse Rock generation. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic, right? And on like that. That was my generation. So those of you who know and have memorized the preamble to the United States Constitution, listen to this as I read the preamble to the Confederate States of America Constitution. We the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent and federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Now, one of the things when I teach this in class, I ask, what's different? And you will notice, of course, the reference to states' rights at the beginning, each state. But what you'll also notice is a reference to Almighty God. There is no reference to God in the United States Constitution. We'll get to this in a second, right? Now, technically, at the end, it says the year of our Lord, 1787. So, like, if someone really wants to make a big stink and say the Constitution is a Christian document, they could say it mentions the Lord at the end. Here's how I usually respond to that. That was added there by a scribe well after the Constitutional Convention all went home, right? So it wasn't like they were debating whether to put that in there or not, right? That was the standard way of doing the debate. But anyway, I'm digressing. The northern ministers became so upset with the constant preamble to the Constitution that they formed an organization. Many northern ministers formed an organization called the NRA, not that NRA, the National Reform Association. And the whole purpose of the National Reform Association was to add the words Almighty God to an amendment to tack on to the Constitution so that the U.S. Constitution would also reference God so that the Confederates could not, like, say, we won the day because we have God in our Constitution and you don't, so we're more of a Christian nation than you do. I mean, there's a whole organization surrounding this. So here's just some examples of the way that this was fought over, right? I forgot about this Civil War one that I had, and I'm glad that the slide woke me up to that. All right, now let's hit the next one. Hopefully this is what I want. Good. Point two. Point two is the Bible was important to the revolutionary generation. If you read the original documents and the letters and the writings of the members who were at the Continental Congress, which signed the Declaration of Independence, if you read the records of the members who were part of the organization of the Articles of Confederation, which was the government during the 1780s, if you read the records and letters and writings of the Constitutional Convention members, the Bible is everywhere, right? Don't let anyone tell you that they didn't quote the Bible or the Bible wasn't present. The Bible's everywhere in that literature. Now, back in the 80s, and the study still holds up, I think, a University of Houston political scientist named Donald Lutz got a team of researchers, and they dug in and studied all of the references that the Founding Fathers made to ancient and contemporary sources. So the Bible was part of that. So were like Enlightenment writers from the 18th century, like ancient writers like Plato or Socrates or Cicero or people like that. All of the outside sources that had been quoted in the public and private writings of all of the signers of these documents. And what they found was the Bible was the most cited document. Somewhere around 30% of all the quotations were from Scripture, Old and New Testament. Now, there are some who will run with this statistic, and they will say, there you go. There's proof. This is a Bible-founded country and so forth. And in some ways, they might have a point. But you also have to realize that 30% is still a minority. 70% of the writings that were quoted by the founders were either Enlightenment, ancient writers, Greeks, Romans, so forth. So clearly they did not just draw on one text like the Bible, but 70% of the things that they drew from were not biblical sources. So it all depends how you want to use those statistics when it comes to these kinds of things. But nevertheless, the Bible was quoted many times. I mean, most of the Founding Fathers were fairly biblically literate and could appeal to the Bible as a kind of work of literature that illustrated some of the points that they wanted to make. Now, so that's a fact. I mean, that's indisputable. What interested me, however, when I started thinking about this was how was the Bible used? And here, it was hard to find how the Founding Fathers used the Bible, but there's plenty of evidence as to how ministers used the Bible, especially patriotic, revolutionary ministers, right? How did they use the Bible? How did they employ the Bible? And did the loyalists, The Tories, those who opposed the American Revolution, how did they use the Bible? Because they used it a lot too, right? That became a more interesting question for me because it seemed to me like the actual data was settled, back in the 80s by Lutz. So let me say something about that for a second. Hit the next slide. Let's take Galatians 5:1 as an example. Galatians 5:1 was a verse that probably was one of the top, well, I should say probably, was one of the top 3 verses used by ministers who were publishing sermons during the time of the Revolution. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. Now, when I learned this verse, for the first time or read this verse, I was told something to the effect of, I was taught this, that we are burdened by a yoke of sin. We are sinners, yoke of slavery, right? Slavery was another word for us being slaves to our sin nature or sin or something. And Christ came to set us free from that sin by dying on the cross and forgiving us of our sins, right? I mean, it's a very basic interpretation. So I went back into church history and looked at the way some of the great thinkers of the ancient church and the Reformation church thought about and wrote about Galatians 5:1. So people like St. Augustine, or Calvin, or Luther, or Thomas Aquinas, who I quoted this morning. These kinds of people, Origen, some of these really early, people. And almost everywhere, there's some variation here and there, right? Some little nuances. But almost everybody kind of interpreted this the same way I had learned it for the first time, right? Christ set us free from sin, from the sin nature. We no longer are bound to, slave. We're no longer slaves to sin. It was a very theological kind of interpretation of the verse. So I thought, okay, that's the way church history has interpreted this verse. Then I was in the archive. Historians go to archives. And I pulled out a copy of a folder. It was at the Rutgers University Special Collections. I pulled out a copy of a folder that said Enoch Green's Sermons. I identified Enoch Green eventually as an 18th century pro-revolutionary chaplain who was giving a speech or a sermon at his church, and his notes were there. He left his sermon notes for us all to look at. So here I am holding these sermon notes, and lo and behold, it was the sermon notes from a sermon on Galatians 5:1, right? And it was 1763, I think. Now I'm leading you into something, but the first thing I'm going to say here is there was no change. Same stuff I had read in Augustine and Calvin and so on, right? We're free from sin, da-da-da-da-da. But then I kept turning the pages in the folder. And I found a sermon, maybe 100 pages later, a Galatians 5:1 sermon that Enoch Green preached in April of 1775. Roughly around the time of Lexington and Concord, right? The shots have now been fired, right? And he's giving a sermon. He's a local Presbyterian pastor in southern New Jersey. And here's, just to paraphrase, here's the kind of things he said. He said that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And he told his congregation, in his, the sermon notes were there, he told his congregation that the yoke of slavery was the British Parliament, right? This slavery of taxation, of Stamp Acts and Sugar Acts and Townsend duties and coercive acts, right? He said this is a metaphor for the British Parliament enslaving us, taking away our liberties, right? And then he said, it's for freedom that patriots have risen up to resist this burden of slavery that the British government had laid upon us. And then came the kicker. literally the words in the sermon said, this is all that it said: Christ equals Continental Army. This is one of these things where, like, you're a historian, you're like, boom, like, this is amazing. So he clearly was, I don't know what he actually preached. Maybe these were just his notes and he never did anything with them. I always just assumed, like, ministers, if you're a minister out there, I was used to assume, like, what was it, like 12 years later, you just, like, went into the file and pulled out the old Galatians 5:1 and you preached it again, and no one remembered from 12 years ago, right? But this guy clearly had changed the entire interpretation over the course of the 12 years because the political situation led him to think differently about how he was going to handle that text. So you think politics did not influence the pulpit back then? Now there's too much politics in the church. There was more politics in the church in 1776 than there was today, I'm guessing. So, for me as a historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm not a New Testament scholar. I can't tell you whether or not what Enoch Green preached on that April Sunday in 1775 is an accurate reading of Galatians 5:1. I can tell you as a historian it's an innovative reading. Right? No one has done that. No one has preached that sermon, that text in that way before. Now, let's click to the next slide. I said the loyalists also used the Bible a lot, and their favorite verse, which was the most cited verse in Revolutionary America in published sermons, Romans 13. I want to read this passage of Romans 13, and as I'm reading it, I want you to think about what it would be like to preach this sermon if you're a loyalist, say an Anglican minister, preaching this sermon in 1776 to your congregation. Okay, and I'm going to emphasize with my voice some of the let you see where I'm going here. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Of course, the power is governmental power, right? So this then raises a huge debate. Is this about, is high taxes enough to disobey Romans 13? Right? This became the debate in the 18th century. I'm not asking this as an ethical question. You can debate that amongst yourselves. I'm just talking about what they said in the 18th century. Is there something more than just high taxes? I mean, when a government comes in and closes down your port and shuts down, like they did after the Boston Tea Party, and shuts down your ability to make an economic livelihood, is that enough to disobey government? Well, the Patriots said absolutely. Romans 13 does not apply here, right? The Anglican clergy who preach it. Remember, you ever see Hamilton, the soundtrack, Samuel Seabury? Does that name ring a bell, right? I am Samuel Seabury, right? That guy in the Hamilton play. Samuel Seabury was a big guy in this. He would say, he actually preached a sermon in which he said, Christians were going to the lions in the Colosseum in Rome under Nero when Paul wrote these words: obey the government, even if they're killing you. Obey the government, where that was their argument. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you, you can have that debate on your own back in your mental improvement societies and juntos. But as a historian, it's just fascinating to me that this is how they were using Scripture, too, to argue against the Patriots, saying the American Revolution was inherently unscriptural, it was unjust, it was an unjust war, right? And it was, even one person said it was conceived in sin, right? A violation of Romans 13. Because nothing that the British did would have reached such heights that they would have had to disobey, that the Patriots had the justification to disobey Romans 13. And other, like 1 Peter 2 was another one. Fear God, honor the king, right, was another one they used. So again, the point being here, the Bible's everywhere. I was really interested in the way it was used. Point 3, let's click to the next slide. This gets back to this discussion we had a second ago about the Constitution. The Constitution does not mention God, except for that year of our Lord thing, right? But there's no reference to God in the Constitution. Christian God or some other God. Nature's God, like in the Declaration of Independence, no God. It mentions religion only once in the original document. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that there will be no test oath. In other words, you don't have to swear a Christian oath to serve in the federal government, in a position in the federal government. No test oath. So anybody, you don't have to be a Christian or any other religion to serve in the federal government. Now, of course, by early 1790s, you do get the First Amendment, which of course is tacked on later, which talks about two things related to religion, right? The freedom of religion, the free exercise clause, right, which says government cannot interfere with your free exercise of religion, and what is often known as the disestablishment clause, that says there will be no established church, no established religion in the United States, no state church. You understand what a state church is? A state church is a national church where you pay taxes that go to the church so that the church can pay the salary of ministers and upkeep the buildings and so forth, even if you're not a member of that church. Right? So, if you're a Baptist in 18th century Virginia, which has a state church of Anglicanism, you can't, even if you have to still pay a tax to pay the salary of the Anglican minister in your town, even though you don't go to that church. Right? That's a state church. No state churches in the United States. And that's it. That's pretty much all the Constitution says. Now, I'm a firm believer in what we call federalism. Federalism essentially says that anything that, or at least on this issue, I'm a strong believer in federalism. Let's put it that way. Federalism says anything that's not mentioned in the United States Constitution, the states are free to engage in that. And I think this is a perfect example of this concept of federalism at work, at least in the 1780s. This concept is going to change later on. Here's what I mean by that. Let's go to the next slide. This is my home state, or the state at least I live in now and lived for 20 some odd years. This is the Pennsylvania State Constitution. Remember, all of the states developed their own state constitutions around 1776. Right, so you had the federal constitution in 1787, the one we have today, and then right after the Revolution, each state developed their own constitution. Here's what the Pennsylvania State Constitution says. In order to vote and in order to hold office in the state of Pennsylvania, you must believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, and you must acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be given by divine inspiration. I mean, that rules out anyone who doesn't believe in God. They can't hold office. Jews, because they don't believe in the inspiration of the New Testament. There are some state constitutions that actually specify Protestants, right, which leaves Catholics out. The point I'm making here is that despite the fact that the United States Constitution says there is no establishment or there is no test oath, the states it was perfectly legal based upon the 10th Amendment, which said the states could do whatever they want with church and state, to have a constitution like this. My favorite one is Vermont. Today we think of Vermont as like the forefront of everything progressive, right? First state to allow gay civil unions, all those kind of people up in Burlington who are like out there on the kind of countercultural left, all these Vermonters. Vermont's state constitution, they weren't one of the original 13 colonies, but they became a state almost very shortly after the Revolution, basically says that you not only have to obey or believe in the inspiration of the Old and New Testament, but you also have to attend church on the Sabbath in order to vote or hold office. Now, please tell me that these people in Vermont and Pennsylvania and other states, which are all like this, do not want to establish some type of a Christian, for good or for bad. You can argue whether it's a good thing, but don't tell me historically that they don't want to establish some type of Christian society. They only want Christians running their government. Anyone else is out. Now, again, this is in the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s. I should say a lot of them get rid of these requirements by like the turn of the 19th century. And you could even argue that these requirements are irrelevant today once the 14th Amendment gets applied to the states, which means the states now have to conform to what the Constitution says. You can no longer have this today. But I'm not interested right now with you tonight in whether or not America is a Christian nation or isn't. I'm interested in was it founded as one, right? That's a historical question, not a political question. So that's complicated. By the way, do you know what the government was? I've already mentioned it tonight in the lecture. Do you know what the government was under, or at the time these state constitutions were built? The Articles of Confederation. There was no union. All the power was vested in states prior to the Constitution. There was no even a semblance of the idea of a nation. It was 13 individual states, all with their own ways of doing this, right? Now, one big exception to that rule, Virginia. And it was there that you had people like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, who insisted that church and state should remain completely separate. There would be no established church, no test oaths, and they were arguing against another guy you may have heard of, the governor of the state, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, he also rejected a state church. He didn't want Anglicanism being the official church of Virginia. But Patrick Henry still believed that there should be a religion tax. And that tax, it was called the general assessment, would be doled out to everybody. Everyone would have to pay it, I should say. And it would be funneled into your individual church. So if you were a Baptist, the Baptists would get the money. If you were an Anglican, you had to designate where you wanted your tax to go to support, what denomination. And if you didn't have a denomination, it was used for poor relief, the tax. Jefferson and Madison rejected that view because they thought this was still government taxing the people for religious purposes. The government needs to stay out of religion completely. In the end, Jefferson and Madison won that battle. And you know who supported him? Mostly evangelical Christians in Virginia. And the reason they did was because under the Anglican establishment during the colonial period, Anglicans persecuted evangelicals. They persecuted Baptists and evangelical Presbyterians and Quakers, evangelical Quakers and others. And as a result, these evangelicals could not wait to get the government out of the religion business. And they, in droves, wrote petitions. You can still read these in the archives. They wrote petitions saying, we want Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson, by the way, really had no Christian beliefs, whatsoever. He rejected the resurrection. He didn't believe in the deity of Christ, right? But the evangelicals sided with him because he was going to get the Anglican Church off their backs and champion religious freedom. I gave a similar talk like this once at a small little town I mentioned earlier called Lynchburg, Virginia. And I said, you can disagree with Jefferson and Madison, but it was your people, the Baptists, the evangelical Baptists of Virginia. They were the ones who supported freedom of religion, right? So there's an interesting sort of side note there. I've never been invited back to Liberty. So, complicated, complex, right? This question of, how do you balance the states and the federal government when you ask this question about was it a Christian country? Let's go to the next one. 2 more points, these will be quick. Every founding father to a man. I know of no founding fathers who, again, associated with those major documents, opposed religious freedom or religious liberty. You see here Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, probably one of the greatest statements of religious liberty ever uttered globally, right? Other countries have drawn on Jefferson's statement. This statement, by the way, came directly out of that controversy with Patrick Henry that I just discussed. And historians are a little divided on this, but I'm on the side of that the U.S. Constitution, a year later, essentially built their view of church and state for the federal government on Jefferson's statement. Free exercise of religion, no state church. This is the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Anyone visited this or been to Newport? If you ever get up in New England, it's a nice place to stop. But George Washington, as the first president of the United States, wrote a letter to every religious group in America, not just Christian, religious group in America, telling them that we will defend your right to worship freely in this country. The most famous is his letter to the Jews of Rhode Island, right, who worshiped in this building. He even wrote a letter to this tiny little sect called the Swedenborgians, which was this almost like a cult-like sect. He wrote a letter to them even and said, under my administration, you will be able to worship freely in the way you want. Now, here's what's interesting, right? They all defended religious freedom, but if you lived in Pennsylvania, if you were a Jew, you could worship freely, but you couldn't vote, right? Or you couldn't hold office. So here are the inherent contradictions, and it's hard for us to get our heads around these kinds of things today. But every founding father upheld the right of people to worship freely. This was a revolutionary idea that had not been instituted to the level that it had been instituted in any other country, with perhaps the Dutch Republic of the Netherlands, which had a very free republic system. That's why the Pilgrims went there before they came to Plymouth Rock. You know that? They spent some time in Holland because they were allowed to be free there. So certainly religious freedom is at the heart of the American founding. And then finally, my last point. Let's hit the next slide. The founders believed that Christianity was good for the republic. And let me explain what I mean by that, because this deserves a little bit of explanation. Many of the founders were Christians. Many of them were not Christians. If you hear somebody on the news or do that 24-hour Google thing I told you to do, or hear people say, well, all the founders, they were deists, or they were Christians, or they were whatever, just stop there and say no. Because the founding fathers really, with the exception of the documents that they all signed, they hardly agreed on anything related to religion and church and state kind of issues. So there were Christians, there were non-Christians, I argue that there was not a deist among them, because they all believed in some aspect of providence. And if you're a pure deist in the 18th century, you don't believe God intervenes. God just created the world and let it run by natural laws. He doesn't intervene and come back in and answer your prayers and perform miracles and so forth. He might come back at the end to wrap it all up and send you someplace based on how good you were, but certainly he doesn't intervene. Nevertheless, the founders saw Christianity as important because Christianity taught people how to be virtuous. Now, when I just said the word virtue, I'm guessing some of you went to Victorian age novels or the virtue of women and it's usually a gendered word. And in the 18th century, it was a woman's virtue, right? In the 18th century, this idea of virtue was actually a very masculine idea. It was a political idea. And a virtuous person in a classic kind of 18th century view of a republic was someone who was willing at times to sacrifice his or her, mostly his, interests for the greater good of the republic. A virtuous person was selfless. They thought about the nation or the country more than they felt about themselves. And the founders believed that Christianity was people who were Christians were good for the republic because they knew how to be virtuous. In other words, because they were so used to sacrificing their selves, in an ideal world, I guess, for their God, or living in obedience to something greater than them, that they would make good Republican citizens, and that might translate very well into them being good people for the nation, for the republic. So they wanted to instill this kind of virtue in people, and they thought Christianity was the best way to do it. Now, remember, there's a temptation out there in certain sectors to turn the founding fathers into like pastors or Christian leaders of some type, right? The founding fathers were building a republic. That was their goal, to build a healthy republic. They knew from their study of history, especially the Roman Republic, that when people do things that are, selfish, or, quote the book of Judges, right, things that are right in their own eyes, when people act in a self-interested way and don't act virtuous, republics always have fallen. They don't work, right, because people are too selfish. They degenerate. That's what they were trying to build. I would argue that if there was a form of Christianity or of religion that did not serve the good of the nation, let's just say there was a form of Christianity that spoke truth to power against the nation, or said, like William Lloyd Garrison in the 19th century, burn up the Constitution because it allows slavery. It's an immoral document. Or somebody who, based on their faith, said that the nation is corrupt, or the founding fathers are greedy, selfish men, or slaveholders, or whatever. My argument is that the founding fathers would have no use for that kind of Christianity, that kind of prophetic Christianity, because it didn't serve their ultimate goal, which was to make citizens. And a republic only survives with citizens, and citizens are characterized by this kind of virtue that I just described. So yes, the founding fathers did believe that Christianity was absolutely essential in creating good citizens, but they had really no use for it if it didn't serve that purpose. And again, why would they? They were politicians. They were framers of governments. They weren't, trying to get people saved or preach the gospel to people. That wasn't their goal. Sometimes we forget about that when we have this debate about Christian America. So in a soundbite culture where public figures appeal to the past to secure political points or advance a particular cultural agenda, it's my hope that Americans might think directly about, or deeply, I should say, about the role that Christianity played in the American founding. We owe it to ourselves to be informed citizens who can speak intelligently and thoughtfully about our nation's past. Thank you. I think there's some time for questions. Does anyone have questions from the audience? I'm happy to entertain them. And Professor Faber here will come up on stage when it's time to end. Yes, in the back.
I noticed with the language you use, for instance, when you say famous women and men, or when you talk about marriage as a civil union, that you use very specific wording for a lot of the things you say. Is there a reason for that? Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, the question makes sense. I'm not quite sure how. I think when I mentioned civil unions, I was mentioning that Vermont, before there was any state that allowed gay marriage, Vermont had already been the first state to allow same-sex civil unions. That just was a factual statement. I wasn't trying to imply anything by that. In terms of men and women, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I think I did stop myself when I almost said women about masculine virtue, right? Because women did not have the power to be able to participate in public life in the 18th century. So So yeah, just trying to use inclusive language because some of these things, when, men and women are involved, that's all. Yeah, nothing conspiratorial or anything like that about that. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
How is this question being used today?
Yeah.
What kind of interaction are you getting
Yeah.
with your book?
Well, it's funny. I'm like the old man in this, the old man scholar now in this debate. Wasn't the case when the book came out. Today you may have heard of something called Christian nationalism. I used that term, I think, briefly early in the talk. The idea of Christian nationalism now has become a hot-button political issue, and it's usually applied to somebody who believes America was founded as a Christian nation and then believes that through the political process, by electing the right people to all offices, we can reclaim America's Christian faith, Christian roots. Have you seen this term around? Christian nationalism. It's everywhere these days. I think sometimes it's used by the left as a kind of boogeyman to describe anyone who has any kind of values, right? I mean, there are pro-life people who believe abortion is wrong who are not Christian nationalists. You know what I mean? But that doesn't make for good sound bites. Right? I mean, so I think I'm a little skeptical. I'm the first person I know of to have used this term. I use it in the book, but I simply used it back in 2012 when the first edition came out to describe people that believe America was founded as a Christian nation. Now, sociologists and political pundits have taken that term, and they have essentially, I think, applied it to anyone who it has become a kind of word to describe anyone who is says something that they deem to be white supremacy or racist, or all evangelicals are Christian nationalists because they want to take over the country and so forth. I do think this idea of Christian nationalism is serious danger, and there are a lot of them out there, right? But I bristle when I hear the word evangelical and Christian nationalism almost used as synonyms, right? So this is a serious issue, and I'll speak just here as an objective observer, if that's possible at this point, if you know some things that I've written. But I think it's normally associated with Christian nationalism has been driving the populist sort of Make America Great Again movement, right? Christian nationalism, when evangelicals hear the word Christian nationalism, conservative evangelicals of a certain stripe, I would even go as far to say, when they hear the word Christian nationalism, they hear the word Make America Great Again, they're thinking Make America Christian again. And that is totally based upon a very unnuanced and very, in some ways, irresponsible use of the founding. I've given this similar talk in certain forums, and some people absolutely hate me when I'm done, and others say thank you, right? But it all goes back. This is why I think historians are just so important in our culture right now, because this goes back. Who are we as a nation? What were we as a nation? To what extent does the past inform the present? How is history being used to advance this or that political agenda? I don't care what it is, right? I'm a champion, first and foremost, of responsible history as a history professor, right? So I think this Christian nationalism thing is something we need to be worried about and we need to think about. And it equates the nation with Christianity. I don't subscribe to that position. And at the same time, it has also been used as a sort of boogeyman on the left to just paint with a broad brush about everybody who has any kind of moral values and want to see some kind of values in society. They're Christian nationalists, right? I'm a defender of what might be called democratic pluralism. I've said this a couple times today in classes. I think we live in a broken world where people have deep differences on some really, really important issues. But and we're never gonna solve those differences, or it's going to be very difficult to solve those differences, but we still need to learn how to live with each other in a community, even as we represent an alternative kingdom, right? But we still need to live with our neighbors that don't believe the way we do. And I think that's got to be the big project for Christian political engagement over the course of the next 20 years or so, because this divisiveness is only going to get worse, I'm afraid. And I think Christians need to think deeply about what it is like to live with people who have profound differences that we really disagree with, but we have to show Christ's love as neighbors and as servants. And that's the challenge, I think, for the church. Are we up for it? Do we have the kind of people in place in the next generation to be able to dig deep? This is why I was so pushing this kind of Christian intellectual life. Do we have the people necessary to be able to make this happen and think about how to solve these problems? I pray that God brings those kinds of people to us. Is that it?
I think we should probably call it a night
Okay.
here.
Before I get myself in more trouble?
Yeah,
Or
right. I want to remind the students that if you want to get chapel credit for coming tonight, there's a QR code outside that you can scan to get that. And with that, let's thank Dr. Fia one more time for his
Thank you, everybody.
presentation.
I just want to say it's been a great day here at Tabor. Thank you, everyone I've met. The hospitality has been great. I've really enjoyed my time here, and God bless this institution and continue to do the work that you're doing. Thanks.